This is my second YouTube video, and what I'd like to do today is give an overview of a facsimile of the 1599 Geneva Bible. This is done by the Geneva Publishing Company, printed in 1990. It's hardback. It is about 11 and an eighth inches tall, roughly 8.5 inches wide, and something like 2 3/8 inches thick. It's printed on very nice paper. It appears to be acid-free. Geneva Publishing Company, 1990, printed in the United States of America. Title page. It is sewn. Whether this is Smythe sewn, I do not know. It's a sewn binding. It's held up very well over the years. Starts with a preface by Michael Brown, and then an introduction to the facsimile edition. The introduction is mostly about King James, and it is not very flattering. It essentially is making the case for the superiority of this edition, the Geneva Bible, over the one that followed. The King James Version, I think, was commissioned at the Hampton Court Conference in about 1604, and finally published in 1611. The Geneva Bible was a very popular Bible at the time the King James came out. Bibliography. This is a bibliography for his little essay on King James. And then we get into the Geneva Bible proper. And it starts off with this very nice woodcut. I will pull it closer so that you can see it there in the video. You have, starting at Reuben and going left, and then down the page, and then back across a bit with Joseph and Benjamin, the 12 tribes of Israel. And then on the right, starting with Peter and ending with Matthew, you have the 12 apostles. In the center, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then sort of an inscription, the Bible, that is the Holy Scriptures contained in the Old and New Testament, translated according to the Hebrew and Greek, and conferred with the best translations in diverse languages, imprinted at London by the deputies of Christopher Barker, printer to the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, 1599. In the front page of the Bible, this particular facsimile was, is that a T or a J? Pentecost, Wallingford, 1782. We have on this page a list of people who've owned it at various times. One page introduction from the translators to the Christian reader. On the opposite page we have a very interesting poem of the incomparable treasure of the Holy Scriptures, with a prayer for the true use of the same. Here is the spring where waters flow to quench our heat of sin. Here is the tree where truth doth grow to lead our lives therein. The chart, how to make profit in reading the Holy Scriptures. And then table of contents, the names and orders of the books of the Old and New Testament. The book's called Apocrypha. Now this is interesting because the Apocryphal Books are not in this 1599 edition. They're left out. Books of the New Testament. Apocryphal Books are in my Hendrickson facsimile of a 1560 edition, but they're not here. Then we get to Genesis, the first book of Moses, with a summary called the argument. Then chapter 1 has headings, a drop cap, very nicely illustrated. For in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. A map, which is set in, I believe, to show the location of Eden. It's interesting to see, King James is very familiar to most of our ears, at least those of us of a certain age. It's interesting to read, to see how close King James is to the Geneva. Geneva, of course, was one of the sources that the King James translators use, at least against which to compare. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord had made. And he said to the woman, "Yea, hath God indeed said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" More illustrations throughout this book. When you come to Exodus, you see a number of illustrations of various items that are discussed in text. The Ark of the Testimony, the propitiatory of the mercy, or the mercy seat, table of shewbread, candlesticks, and it goes on and on. The Geneva Bible has some marginal references. There are kind of few. A great many marginal notes. So here you see a reference to chapter 37, verse 27, marked by an asterisk. But then you also have a marginal note, which maps to this I with work. And then an I, "It shall not be molten, but beaten out of the lump of gold with the hammer." I believe the Geneva Bible was the first study Bible, first annotated Bible. The Douay translators did the same thing with the Douay-Rheims Bible. In Numbers, you have an illustration here of the figure of the tabernacle erected, and of the tents pitched around it. We get to Numbers, and there's a woodcut of the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, the Nile River, and this is the path of the Exodus, at least according to the 1599 version of the Geneva Bible. I want to go to Psalms. Very many people are familiar with the way the 23rd Psalm sounds in the King James Version. Here it is in the Geneva Bible. It's very similar. We have another series of woodcuts in Ezekiel. It's a woodcut in Ezekiel, figure of the temple. Occident, of course, is east, west. Orient is east. When you get to the New Testament, introduced, as was the Old Testament, with a very nice woodcut. It's essentially the same one, but this one starts off by saying this is now the New Testament, and printed at London, 1599. Another bit of introduction, the printer to the diligent reader. A description of the Holy Land containing the places mentioned in the four evangelists. These woodcuts are the kind of thing that one finds here, and not in the Tolle Lege Press version of the same book. This the Tolle Lege Press is much easier to read. It has much of the same material. It has, of course, the text of the Bible and the text of the notes, and I'll be showing some of the appendices later, and morning and evening prayer, at least, from the appendices are in the Tolle Lege Press version, but a great deal of it is missing. And that makes sense. One wouldn't expect a modern version to have all the bells and whistles of the 1599 version. One interesting thing I've noticed is that in the book of Romans, this passage, Romans 5:12, which some authors will tell you St. Augustine came up with the Theology of Original Sin based on a mistranslation of this verse. My view is that the passage is quite clear, and it clearly teaches the transmission of original guilt, Adam's guilt to man. Otherwise, those who had not sinned would not die. In the 1599 version, the passage reads, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death went over all men, in whom all men have sinned." The "in whom" is the way, apparently, St. Augustine read it in the Latin. Now, that's interesting to me because this is same passage in the Hendrickson 1560 facsimile of the Geneva Bible. This is the first printing of the Geneva Bible. "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death went over all men, for as much as all men have sinned." So there was a change in the text of the Geneva Bible between 1560 and 1599. 1599 translators went back to the what is now considered inaccurate translation of "in whom all sinned." Kind of like the English Standard Version, changing from day to day. The font size is about 7.5 point. In the notes, marginal notes, it's about 6 points. It's readable. Some of us with older eyes tend to use magnifying glasses. After the end of the book of Revelation, you have helps. Here we have a brief table of the interpretation of the proper names, which are chiefly found in the Old Testament, wherein the first number signifieth the chapter, the second the verse, and it's alphabetical. Second table is a table of the principal things that are contained in the Bible after the order of the alphabet. The first number noteth the chapter, etc. And so it's something of an index of what they are, what they mean, and where to find them. And then it gets even more interesting here. The book of Psalms, collected in the English meter by Thomas Sternhold and John Hopkins and others, set forth and allowed to be sung in all churches. Before you get to the Psalms, you have the Veni Creator, the humble suite of a sinner. Some of these are what we would find in the modern Book of Common Prayer, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer too. The Venite Exaltamus, the Song of St. Ambrose called Te Deum, or Te Deum, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. The Song of Zechariah called Benedictus. The Magnificat from Mary, the Athanasian Creed. Unfortunately, the musical symbols are lost on me. Lord's Prayer, and then we get to the Psalms. So they're set to music, set to be chanted. This is an accurate facsimile. The publishers point out that there is no page 91 and no page 92. And they give us a note that there were no pages 91 or 92 in the original. The psalm goes from verse 14 on page 90 to verse 15 on page 93. The misnumbering. After the Psalms, of the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, prayer to the Holy Ghost, etc. Goes on. As I mentioned earlier, these are in the Tolle Lege press version. The form of prayer to be used in private houses every morning and evening. This also has a godly prayer to be said at all times, a confession for all estates, a prayer to be said before a man begins his work, prayer for the whole estate of Christ's church. It's not quite the same as Cranmer's version. A prayer against the devil and his manifest temptations, made by St. Augustine. And at the end, table for how to find the Psalms. And that's the end of the book. There are no maps. No map index, of course. But there you have it. A brief overview of the Geneva Publishing Company's 1599 facsimile of 1990 facsimile of the 1599 Geneva Bible.